Welcome to our study this evening. We're continuing in our study of the book of Exodus, and we thank you for joining us once again. As we come to the close of the book of Exodus tonight, we're going to be looking at this section that begins in chapter 25, telling us about the tabernacle. This is the part of Exodus where a lot of people start getting drowsy and maybe lose some of their commitment to their reading program. Or maybe skipped ahead to something interesting or perhaps more interesting. But I think that there's some recognition that is needed on our part that God included this and preserved this in the revelation of His Word. There's a lot of details, tells us all about how the tabernacle was supposed to be built. In fact, we're given even more detail concerning the tabernacle than we are the temple. And we could almost, there are some details that are left out, but we could almost reproduce the tabernacle based on the instructions that are given. And so I think there's some real importance there for us to give the attention that God has given to the tabernacle and notice some things about that. As we go into this study tonight, we're going to try to not only notice what's revealed there, but as we look to the New Testament to see some connections, some things that point forward from the tabernacle to a time when the Messiah would come and the things that are represented there in that tabernacle. I would also just say this, that as we're reading through these descriptions, for me, my family, we do a lot of genealogical work. We look at old family histories. And if you could just imagine rummaging through old family letters and finding a letter that described the house that your great-great-grandmother lived in, told you all about the curtains, about where the kitchen was and the bedrooms and everything about how it looked, I think you'd be pretty interested in reading that. I know I would. And I would look over the details. I would try to picture it, try to imagine it. It would not be important to everyone, but it would be important to us because we would have that sort of connection. I think we kind of need to build that connection to things that are described in God's Word. This is God's house, and it should be of interest to us to picture that and to think about that. And so we want to try to think about those things as well as the spiritual implications as we go through this study tonight. One of the things that we're going to highlight as we go through the study is how often the word pattern or something along those lines is included, that God gives us this very descriptive pattern, but we're also told about how closely the people followed that pattern. That's a concept generally that we want to have in our minds as we're trying to serve God and trying to please God. It's certainly something that Moses kept at the forefront of his mind. And so we'll think about those things as well as we go through the study. As we said, we're beginning in chapter 25. And so, Colton, why don't you tell us about some of the first things we're told about the tabernacle? So as we come into chapter 27, we start talking again more about some of the furniture, both outside and inside of the tabernacle. And one of the most prominent features outside the tabernacle would be the altar where they would prepare burnt offerings. This altar is not going to be nearly as large as the one in the temple. The one in the temple would have been massive. It would have been just a main feature. But of course, the tabernacle is smaller in general. And the altar also had to be portable, of course, because they would pick it up and take it on with them. So it's built with wood and then overlaid with bronze. And you kind of just see some practical things, some practical differences then between this altar and the later altar at the temple. But what I'd like to focus on, in addition to these instructions being given there for the tabernacle, is that when you go over to Leviticus, you see the sorts of offerings that they were supposed to make. And so I'd like to turn over there to the first couple of chapters of Leviticus. In the first chapter of Leviticus, you see the burnt offering described. And one of the things that I would note about that, in verse 4, it says that someone bringing this animal, this male of the herd, a male without defect, verse 3, he brings him, and then in verse 4 it says, he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. In verse 3, it's that he may be accepted before the Lord. And so that idea of bringing the sacrifice so that you may be accepted. Over in Romans chapter 12, the Apostle Paul throughout the book of Romans is making arguments against reliance on the law and pointing the people to Christ. And so in chapter 12, he sort of made all of those arguments, and now he begins to make arguments on the life that the one who's come to Christ ought to live. And it's interesting, one of the first things he says there in Romans chapter 12 is, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And so he says, you offer sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? The sacrifice of yourself to God. For what reason? That you may be accepted before God. Here in Leviticus chapter 1, it's the same reason. You bring sacrifice. Now here, it's a bull that they bring as a sacrifice. And now Paul says, you bring yourself as a sacrifice to be accepted before God. We go on and we see the sacrifice of the grain offering in the second chapter, which would have been an offering of flour, been an offering of the first fruits and so forth. But it was sort of a thanksgiving offering. But then in chapter 3, we would have a peace offering. And it's interesting there as the peace offering is laid out, part of that would be laid on the altar. And so the animal would be dissected, if you will, and part of it put onto the altar. And then part of it would go to the table of the one who was offering the sacrifice. And when they would have this peace offering, the part that would go to God would be the liver, the kidneys, and the heart. The liver, the kidneys, and the fat. And the fat, some people might look at that and think, well, that's the part you'd want to trim away anyway, and so God's just taking the leftovers. It's not at all what's happening. Rather, what's happening is the fat, as you look at that word throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, it means the best. The fat of the land means the best of the land. So God gets the fat. The liver and the kidney, those are organs that would be translated as the heart or our innermost being. Those same words, like we use the word heart, it's an organ, but we use it as sort of the center of our emotions. Well, they would use the words kidney and liver for those same purposes. And so God is getting the aspects of the animal that represent what he wants from the people. The best of the people, the heart of the people, their inmost being, that goes on the altar to God. But then they're sitting down and they're eating the other part of this animal, and it's as if they're having a meal with God. This altar that they are setting up in the tabernacle, it's a way for them to approach God for atonement, to approach God for thanksgiving, to approach God for fellowship, communion with God. Now, when you think about that, Christ is our sacrifice for atonement. He is our mediator to come before God with our petitions and our thanksgiving. And he is the means, his sacrifice is the means by which we sit down and we have a peace offering, a peace meal with God each and every first day of the week. And all of that is wrapped up into one single sacrifice. It's really a beautiful picture as we kind of see the sacrifice of Christ broken out into its various parts here as we explore the way that they would use this altar in the tabernacle. Well, after the tabernacle, we go on with some more instructions about what all's in the courtyard and the arrangement of the courtyard. And Colton, why don't you tell us about that? So when we come to chapter 32, obviously it's some material that we've already covered. And so we're going to skip forward past the story of the golden calf. And we pick back up after the people have been reconciled through Moses' intercession. We kind of bring our attention back to the tabernacle. And as we open chapter 35, is what we see is really some evidence of the people's repentance, that they have recommitted themselves after this brief departure from the commandments of God. And the evidence is that when Moses says it's time to donate materials in order to build the tabernacle, they are so zealous in their donations that it says Moses, I love the wording, has to restrain them from giving any more. And so that's how energetic they are to participate, to be a part of the work that's going forward. And then we come into the next several chapters, beginning in chapter 36, and Bezalel and Aholiab get busy with the work that God has given them and all the other skilled laborers, and they begin to construct the tabernacle. And one of the things that's interesting as you read through those next several chapters is it's some repetition. We've already been given the instructions about what this looks like. And then as they begin constructing, what you're seeing is the repetition is they did it exactly like God told them to do it. I don't think that's just Moses forgetting what he wrote before. In fact, I think, again, we have another emphasis, thorough emphasis to say, they built this aspect just like God said. And then they built this aspect just like God said. And in each case, Moses is emphasizing that they did just what God said in every particular. And so that's important. It's important to Moses, should be important to us. And as we read through that, we shouldn't just get repetition out of it, but we should get emphasis that they're following the pattern. I'd like to then leave off with this notion. Marshall mentioned that idea of the representation of things that are in heavenly places. And in Hebrews chapter 8, it talks about that. It talks about the tabernacle being a thing that was in chapter 9, talking about the tabernacle being a type, not the antitype. And a type of things that were better, pointing forward. When you look at the tabernacle, Marshall was talking about the smoke. We've talked about the laver and the cleanness. All of these are tangible physical representations of spiritual realities, right? The smoke was not God's presence, but it was something that they could look at and see that would indicate God's presence. The water didn't make you spiritually clean, but as it actually washed off dirt, you could think about it washing off the dirtiness of sin. And then, of course, the sacrifices. As you see the blood, they would have actual blood on their hands, which is what sin is blood on our hands. So as we get to the New Testament, none of that's there. You don't feel or smell or see all of these things that are represented in the tabernacle. But the thing that as we move from the Old Testament to the New, we have these representations still in the church. And what God says is the church is the real thing, and those things before were the representations. And that's almost backwards to us, because we think things that are not tangible are the representations, and then physical things, that's the real thing. And then what we see most of all is that the better things in heaven, that's as real as it gets. And so we're moving not to a less and less real place, but to a more and more real place. And spiritual things are more real than physical things. It's another lesson, I think, that we learned from the tabernacle. With all of this tangible representation, they are the copies. They are the types, not the real thing. The real thing is the thing that we can't see and the thing that we can't touch. And that was the real thing even with the tabernacle. The reality was beyond the physical thing that they could touch. And so now that God has taken away the physical, and we can't feel and we can't see so many of those realities, we need to make sure that we see the reality just as much as when they had those physical representations. Well, as we're closing out, I just want to address some questions. Marshall, you said you had a question earlier about the Ark of the Covenant. Yes. Well, that's what I had. Now, I would just add to that the description of the destruction of Jerusalem, especially as you look at Ezekiel, is that the presence of the Lord is departing from the temple. And as the ark being the very even more focused representation of God's presence, I think there's an indicator there that anything special at that point is taken away. The specialness of the temple is taken away. The specialness of the ark would have been taken away. And so I think it loses, at the very least, it loses its importance at that moment. And the likelihood that anything like that has been maintained in its condition, I think, is very low. I have another question on this end about the sacrifices, or a comment. The liver and the kidney are purifiers of our body, and I wonder if there's any connection to that being offered to God. And I think that's a good line of thinking. I mean, I think we ought to be thinking in terms of why God requests those certain organs. But in this particular case, my response would be, as we look at those words used throughout the rest of the Old Testament, they are there's no indication of the function of the organ so much as the representation of that organ. So it would be used in the Psalms, it would be used in Proverbs, it would be used in a lot of poetic language to represent that emotional connection, whatever that is. Sometimes it would be translated heart, in fact. Other times it would be translated our inmost being. And so I think mostly it's like we would say, something we would connect to would be saying, "I got a feeling in my gut." We don't use that language as often, but we do use that some. That would be, I think, the idea here, and God saying, "I want that." I want that center of feeling. You guys have any other questions on your end? All right, Colton, why don't you tell us about what we're looking at next week? All right, we're looking forward to that, and we certainly appreciate everybody joining us this evening. Incidentally, if you came over here from YouTube, sorry about the audio not working. We'll try to get a good video uploaded to our YouTube channel later that you can come back and watch. We appreciate everybody joining us each week. Appreciate your comments, your interaction, And we'll hope to be with you again next week as we finish out our study of the book of Exodus. Thank you so much.